A straight razor sliced through flesh in a dingy Brooklyn brothel, and the cocky bartender's face split open like rotten fruit. 3 jagged cuts: cheek, jaw, neck. Blood pooled on the sawdust floor as the girl's brother wiped the blade clean. The 18-year-old punk had made a crude comment about the wrong woman, and now he'd wear the consequences for life. Years later, when reporters asked about the scars, Alphonse Capone would lie through his teeth, claiming he got them in the war. The truth? He never served a day. He was just another loudmouth who learned to keep his mouth shut. The hard way. That humiliating barroom incident in 1917 gave birth to Scarface, though Capone would spend his entire life ashamed of how he really got the name. Not in some heroic shootout with rival gangsters, not defending his honor or his territory. Just a stupid kid running his mouth in a whorehouse, where his boss, Fränkki Yéle, had him slinging drinks and keeping an eye on the girls. The scar tissue would keloid and pucker, 3 thick white lines that photographers would later learn to shoot from his good side. Capone hated those scars because they told the truth. He wasn't born a monster. He was made into one, piece by piece, mistake by mistake. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the scars, before the murders, before the empire built on blood and bootleg whiskey, there was just a kid from Brooklyn. A poor kid. A nobody. January 17th, 1899. Alphonse Gabriel Capone entered the world in a crowded tenement at 95 Navy Street, 4th of 9 children born to Gabrielle and Teresina Capone. His father cut hair for pennies. His mother sewed by dim lamplight until her fingers bled. They were fresh off the boat from Naples, part of that great wave of Italian immigration that would reshape American cities. The Capones weren't mafia. They weren't connected. They were just poor, desperate, and drowning in the struggle to feed 9 mouths. Young Al grew up in a neighborhood where poverty wasn't just common, it was law. But even surrounded by deprivation, the boy burned with something different than his siblings. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to win. And unlike his 6 brothers and 2 sisters, Alphonse fully embraced his American identity. When anyone called him Italian, the kid would explode. "I'm no Italian. I was born in Brooklyn." It wasn't just pride, it was belief. Belief in the American dream, that mythical promise that anyone could make it big in this country. He just chose the wrong ladder to climb. School bored him. The 6th grade at Public School 7 on Adams Street, that's where everything changed. 14 years old, all restless energy and volcanic temper. The teacher said something that set him off. Maybe she disrespected him. Maybe she was just doing her job. Either way, young Alphonse's fist connected with her face, and that was that. Expelled. Done. His formal education ended before it really began. Most kids would have been terrified. Most parents would have beaten their son bloody. But Gabriele and Teresina had 8 other children and barely enough money to keep the lights on. If Al wanted to throw his life away, he'd have to do it on someone else's dime. So the boy went to work. Real work at first. He sold candy in a shop. He set up bowling pins at the local alley, getting knocked down and scrambling back up over and over for tips. He hauled crates at a munitions plant, his young back straining under weight that would have broken grown men. But honest work paid for shit, and the streets of Brooklyn were crawling with a different kind of opportunity. The gangs weren't like the organized crime syndicates that would come later. These were kid gangs, the South Brooklyn Rippers, the 40 Thieves Juniors. Teenagers running wild, shoplifting, smashing windows, beating the hell out of rival crews. Petty crime, sure, but it was a proving ground. And young Capone proved he had stones. He could take a punch. He could throw one better. Most importantly, he could keep his mouth shut when the cops came around. That's where he met the real players. The James Street boys were different. They had structure. They had a leader, Johnny Torrio, a quiet, methodical gangster who'd later teach Capone everything that mattered. Torrio was what they called a gentleman gangster, which meant he didn't start unnecessary fights, paid his debts, and killed people only when absolutely required. The kid from Navy Street soaked up Torrio's philosophy like a sponge absorbs blood. In 1909, Torrio headed west to Chicago. Big opportunities, bigger money. He left young Capone behind, but not before introducing him to another mentor, Frenkie Yele, who ran the Harvard Inn, a Coney Island dive that was half saloon, half brothel. Yale hired the teenage Capone as a bouncer and bartender. Good money, better education. Al learned how to spot a troublemaker before fists started flying. He learned how to water down drinks without getting caught. He learned which cops took bribes and which ones needed threatening instead. And then came that night. The girl, the crude comment, the brother with the razor, the scars. Yale felt bad about it. After all, Capone had been working for him when it happened. But business was business, and a bartender with a face like chewed meat wasn't exactly good for the respectable image Yale tried to maintain. Still, Yale kept the kid around. There was something about Capone, something hungry, something useful. By 1918, Alphonse had married May Coughlin, an Irish girl who'd gotten pregnant. Respectable people would have called her stupid for marrying a two-bit thug with a ruined face, but May saw something in him. Or maybe she just didn't have better options. Either way, she said yes, and on December 4th, 1918, she gave birth to Albert Francis Capone, Sonny to his father. What May didn't know yet was that her new husband had already infected her with syphilis. Capone had been sleeping with prostitutes, a perk of working in Yale's establishment. The disease had already taken root in his blood, and now it was in hers too. And their newborn son. The bacteria spiraled through Sonny's tiny body, leaving him partially deaf. Al knew. He had the sores, the rashes, the flu-like symptoms that came and went, but he refused treatment because treatment meant telling May about the other women. And telling May meant admitting what kind of man he really was. So he let the disease fester. That decision, that cowardly, selfish decision, would eventually destroy his brain and turn him into a drooling invalid. But that was years away. In 1918, Al Capone was 20 years old, married with a kid, working for Frenkie Yele, and going absolutely nowhere. He was just another Brooklyn punk with a scarred face and limited prospects. Then his father died. Before we dive deeper into how death transformed Capone from street thug to crime lord, let me ask you something. Are you hooked yet? Because this story only gets darker. If you want to see where this blood-soaked path leads, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you're fascinated by how ordinary people become monsters. And tell me in the comments, do you think Capone was born evil, or did circumstances make him this way? Now back to the story. Gabriele Capone collapsed in 1920. Heart attack. Dead before he hit the floor. And just like that, 21-year-old Al became the man of the family. Not the oldest son, that was Vincenzo, who'd already changed his name to Richard Hart and become a prohibition agent out west, hunting bootleggers while his brother would soon become one. Not one of the other brothers who'd found legitimate work. No, the responsibility fell to Al, because Al was the one who'd already proven he could bring in money. Dirty money, sure, but money that kept the lights on and food on the table. According to family members interviewed decades later, this was the turning point. The moment when Capone might have chosen a different path, got buried with his father. Teresina was devastated, and Al was fiercely devoted to his mother. He called her every single day for the rest of his criminal career, lying about what he did for a living, spinning elaborate stories about legitimate business ventures. She probably knew the truth. Mothers usually do. But she needed her son's money, and Al needed to believe he was taking care of his family like a good Italian son should. The mantle of criminal greatness was thrust upon his unwilling shoulders, one biographer would later write. That's bullshit, of course. Nobody forced Capone to become a killer. But the death of his father did remove whatever slim chance existed that Al might have stayed small-time. Now he needed real money. Serious money. And Johnny Torriо had just sent word from Chicago. "Come west, kid. I've got work for you." Torrio had done well in the Windy City. Very well. He'd become lieutenant to Big Jim Colosimo, who ran an empire of brothels, gambling dens, and labor rackets. Colosimo was old-school Italian mob, the kind who controlled the Italian immigrant neighborhoods through a mix of intimidation and patronage. When the Volstead Act passed in 1920, establishing prohibition, Torrio saw an opportunity that would make all of Colosimo's previous operations look like pocket change. Bootlegging. Illegal booze. Every speakeasy in Chicago would need supplies, and Torrio wanted to be the man who supplied them. But Colosimo wasn't interested. The old boss had gotten comfortable, rich enough, lazy enough. Why risk everything on this new venture when the brothels and gambling brought in steady cash? Torrio argued. Colosimo refused. And on May 11th, 1920, Big Jim Colosimo was shot to death in his own restaurant. Nobody was ever arrested for the murder, but everyone knew Torrio ordered the hit. And everyone suspected that 21-year-old Al Capone, fresh off the train from New York, had pulled the trigger, or at least helped. The timing was too perfect. Colosimo dead, Torrio in charge, Capone at his right hand. Welcome to Chicago, kid. Torrio taught Capone everything that mattered. First lesson, separate work and family. Always. Torrio believed that a real boss never mixed business with his personal life. Keep your hands clean, Torrio would say. Use others for the dirty work. That meant maintaining a respectable front. Capone took this to heart. He moved his wife and son into a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood. He told the neighbors he was in the second-hand furniture business. May kept the house spotless. Sonny went to Catholic school. Teresina moved in with them, and Al doted on his mother, kissing her hand every morning like a dutiful son. Meanwhile, he was building a criminal empire. The organization that would become the Chicago Outfit started small. Torrio and Capone focused on bootlegging, but they didn't brew or distill anything themselves. Too risky. Instead, they purchased illegal alcohol from manufacturers and distributed it to speakeasies throughout the city. They cultivated relationships with corrupt politicians, cops on the take, union leaders who could be bought. They invested in legitimate businesses, laundries, cleaning services, both for money laundering and for creating a respectable facade. But Chicago wasn't some open territory waiting to be claimed. Other gangs had their own operations, their own territories, their own ambitions. The North Side Gang, led by Dean O'Banion, controlled the wealthy neighborhoods north of the Chicago River. The Jenna brothers, 6 Sicilian siblings, ran alcohol operations on the south side, and dozens of smaller outfits fought over the scraps. Torrio tried negotiation first. He met with O'Banion, proposed dividing the city into territories, avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. For a while, it worked. But O'Banion was an Irish hothead who'd grown up in the same kind of poverty as Capone, He didn't like taking orders from Italians. He didn't like sharing. And he especially didn't like how much money Torriо and Capone were making. On November 10, 1924, Dean O'Banion was arranging flowers in his shop. He ran a legitimate florist business as a front, when 3 men walked in. O'Banion thought they were customers. He turned around to greet them, hands full of chrysanthemums, and they shot him 6 times. 2 bullets to the chest, 2 to the throat, 2 to the face, just to make sure. The assassins walked out calmly, got into a car, and disappeared. Again, nobody was arrested. Again, everyone knew who'd ordered it. Torrio and Capone sent an enormous floral arrangement to O'Banion's funeral. The card read, "From Johnny and Al." That took balls. That took the kind of arrogance that said, "We killed your boss, we all know it, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it." But the North Side Gang had something to say about it. 2 months later, on January 24, 1925, Johnny Torrio was carrying groceries into his apartment building when a car screeched up. Machine gun fire ripped through the street. Torrio went down, bullets in his jaw, chest, and abdomen. The shooters approached to finish him off, standing over the bleeding mob boss with guns pointed at his head. Then their weapons jammed. Click, click, click. Torrio survived by sheer luck, or divine intervention if you believe in that sort of thing. The assassination attempt changed everything. Torrio spent weeks in the hospital, barely clinging to life. When he recovered enough to think straight, he made a decision that would reshape organized crime in America. He called Capone to his hospital bed and said, "It's yours. All of it. I'm done." Torrio wasn't being generous. He was being smart. The North Side Gang wanted him dead, and they'd keep trying until they succeeded. The Jennas were circling. The cops were closing in. Torrio had made enough money to retire comfortably. Why die in Chicago when he could live in Brooklyn? So he served 9 months in prison for running an illegal distillery, then sailed back to New York, where he'd eventually help found the National Commission of the American Mafia in 1934, becoming a kind of elder statesman of organized crime. But in 1925, Torrio's retirement meant that 26-year-old Al Capone, the kid with the scarred face, the 6th-grade dropout, the guy who'd been nobody just 5 years earlier, was now the boss of the Chicago outfit. And he was hungry. Hungrier than Torrio had ever been. Hungrier than Colosimo could have imagined. Capone didn't just want money. He wanted respect. He wanted fame. He wanted to be somebody. And he was willing to kill anyone who stood in his way. The beer wars had begun, and they'd paint Chicago's streets red for the next 4 years. The North Side Gang, now led by Jaime Weiss, wanted revenge for O'Banion. The Jennas wanted a bigger piece of the bootlegging business. Smaller gangs saw opportunity in the chaos, and Capone sat at the center of it all, orchestrating violence like a conductor leading a symphony of death. Bodies piled up. Gangsters found in alleys with their throats cut. Rivals gunned down in restaurants. Bombs planted in cars, in homes, in businesses. Chicago became a war zone, and the newspapers ate it up. Capone, with his expensive suits and fedora hats, became the face of organized crime. He cultivated the press, inviting reporters to interview him, spinning stories about being a businessman who simply gave the people what they wanted. "I make my money by supplying a public demand," he told one journalist. "If I break the law, my customers, the best people in Chicago, are as guilty as me. The only difference is that I sell and they buy." Everybody calls me a racketeer. I call myself a businessman. It was brilliant. P.R. Capone positioned himself as a Robin Hood figure, a working-class hero who provided jobs for Italian immigrants and kept speakeasies stocked so regular folks could have a drink. Never mind the murders, never mind the prostitution rings, never mind the protection rackets that squeezed small businesses dry. Capone was just giving people what they wanted, and if some violence was necessary to maintain order, well, that was just the cost of doing business. By 1929, the Chicago outfit employed over 1,000 people directly and controlled perhaps 10,000 speakeasies across the city. Capone's annual income hit $40 million, roughly $550 million in today's money. He owned breweries, distilleries, nightclubs, gambling houses, brothels. He had judges on the payroll, cops, aldermen, state legislators. Even some federal agents looked the other way for the right price. And the body count? Conservative estimates put it at 700 murders connected to Capone's organization between 1925 and 1931. 700. That's not counting the victims of rival gangs or unrelated violence, just the people killed on Capone's orders or by his men. 700 families destroyed, 700 funerals, 700 graves. Capone didn't personally pull the trigger on most of them. He followed Torrio's advice: keep your hands clean. He had soldiers for wet work, guys like Jake Guzik, his financial brain, Frank Nitti, who'd later take over the outfit, Tony Accardo, a stone-cold killer who'd survive into the 1990s. These men did the dirty work while Capone maintained his respectable facade, playing the businessman, the family man, the misunderstood entrepreneur. But some hits were too important to delegate. Some sent a message that required the boss's personal touch. And on July 1st, 1928, Capone decided it was time to send a very loud message to his old mentor, Frenkie Yele. Yale had helped launch Capone's career back in Brooklyn. He'd given the scarred kid a job when nobody else would. But Yale had made a crucial mistake. He'd been hijacking Capone's Canadian whiskey shipments, stealing product that was supposed to reach Chicago's speakeasies. Worse, Yale had been playing both sides, selling information to rival gangs. Friendship was one thing, business was another. And business always came first. Yale was driving through Brooklyn in his brand-new coffee-colored Lincoln coupe when another car pulled alongside. Windows rolled down. And then came the sound that would define the era, the brutal staccato of a Thompson submachine gun, nicknamed the Tommy gun. 45 bullets ripped through Yale's car. His body was found slumped over the wheel, so riddled with holes that the medical examiner stopped counting. It was one of the first major gangland murders using a Thompson submachine gun. The weapon would become synonymous with the era, its distinctive rat-a-tat-tat soundtrack to countless murders. And everyone knew who'd ordered the hit on Yale. The cops knew. The newspapers knew. Even Yale's widow knew. But knowing and proving were two different things. Capone was in Chicago when Yale died, surrounded by witnesses who'd swear on their mother's graves that the boss was playing cards all night. Perfect alibi, perfect crime. Perfect message to anyone else thinking about betraying Al Capone. I'll kill my own mentor if he crosses me. What makes you think I'll spare you? The violence escalated. Jaime Weiss, who'd taken over the North Side gang after O'Banion's death, was machine-gunned outside a church. 10 men with Tommy guns, over 1,000 rounds fired. Weiss's successor, Bugs Moran, survived multiple assassination attempts. The Jenna brothers, one by one, were eliminated, shot, stabbed, bombed. Chicago had become a slaughterhouse, and Capone was the head butcher. But Capone also understood that violence alone wouldn't secure his empire. He needed legitimate fronts, respectable businesses that could launder money and provide cover for his criminal operations. That's where the milk business came in. It sounds ridiculous now. Al Capone, ruthless killer selling milk. But according to family lore, one of Capone's relatives got sick from spoiled milk, and it sparked an idea. Capone and his brother opened a dairy farm and milk distribution company. They were among the first in Chicago to stamp expiration dates on milk bottles, a genuine public service that also helped legitimize Capone's image as a businessman who cared about his community. The milk operation never made serious money compared to bootlegging, but it showed Capone's mindset. He genuinely believed he could transition from crime to legitimate business eventually. He saw himself as an entrepreneur who'd started in a tough industry and would eventually go legit. The milk business was supposed to be step one, a trial run, proof that Al Capone could be more than a gangster. He was wrong, of course. Once you've killed 700 people, society doesn't just let you rebrand as a dairy farmer. But Capone's delusion was genuine. He truly believed in the American dream, even as he corrupted and destroyed everything that dream represented. And then came February 14th, 1929, Valentine's Day, the massacre that would cement Capone's reputation as the most brutal gangster in American history. Bugs Moran's North Side gang had been a thorn in Capone's side for years. They'd tried to kill Torriо. They'd hijacked outfit shipments. They'd refused every attempt at negotiation. Moran needed to go. But Moran was careful, paranoid, surrounded by bodyguards. A direct hit would be difficult. So Capone's men devised a plan so audacious, so perfectly executed, that it would shock the entire nation. The North Side gang used a garage at 2122 North Clark Street as their headquarters. On the morning of February 14th, 7 men gathered there. 6 gang members and 1 unlucky optometrist who hung around with criminals for the thrill. They were waiting for a shipment of whiskey when a police car pulled up outside. 4 men got out, 2 in police uniforms, 2 in plain clothes. The North Side guys figured it was a routine raid. Annoying, but manageable. They'd been arrested before. They'd pay the bribes, spend a night in lockup, and be out by morning. The cops ordered the 7 men to line up against the wall. Standard procedure during a bust. The gangsters complied, arms raised, faces to the brick. They probably grumbled about corrupt cops shaking them down again. They probably didn't see the Thompson submachine guns until it was too late. The shooting lasted maybe 30 seconds. Over 70 bullets fired at point-blank range. Bodies jerked and danced like puppets as lead tore through flesh, bone, organs. When the shooting stopped, 6 men were dead or dying. The 7th, Frank Gusenberg, somehow survived long enough for the real cops to arrive. "Who shot you?" they asked. Gusenberg, with 14 bullets in his body, gasped, "Nobody shot me." He died 3 hours later. The massacre made front-page news across America. The brutality, the execution-style murders, the fact that the killers had dressed as police officers. It was too much. Chicago had tolerated gang violence when it stayed in the shadows, when it was criminals killing criminals. But this was terrorism. This was warfare on American streets, and everyone knew who'd ordered it. Bugs Moran, who'd arrived late and escaped the massacre by pure luck, told reporters, "Only Capone kills like that." The press dubbed Capone public enemy number 1. The Chicago Crime Commission launched investigations. The federal government started paying attention. But Capone? He was in Miami when the massacre happened, being questioned by police about a completely different murder. Perfect alibi. His lawyers made sure reporters knew exactly where the boss had been when those 7 men were executed in Chicago. And just to drive the point home, Capone hired a press agent after the massacre, Not to deny involvement. That would have been insulting everyone's intelligence. No. The press agent's job was to manage Capone's image, to spin the narrative, to keep the boss's name in the papers in ways that didn't involve indictments. The St. Valentine's Day massacre was supposed to end the beer wars, kill Moran's top men, and the North Side gang would collapse. Except Moran survived. The gang didn't collapse. And now Capone had heat he'd never experienced before. Federal heat. The kind that didn't care about bribes or threats. But we're getting ahead of the story, because before the feds could bring down Capone, he had another battle to fight. A battle with an entire city that didn't want him. A battle with Miami Beach, Florida. In 1928, Capone decided he needed a winter retreat, somewhere warm, somewhere far from Chicago's freezing winters and increasingly dangerous streets. Somewhere he could play the respectable millionaire instead of the gangster everyone knew him to be. Miami Beach seemed perfect, a booming resort town where northern money flowed freely, and local officials historically looked the other way when wealthy men arrived with questionable backgrounds. Capone found his paradise, a palatial estate on Palm Island, 14 rooms of Mediterranean revival architecture sitting on waterfront property worth a fortune. The place had belonged to Clarence Bush, and it was everything a man of Capone's wealth deserved. Swimming pool, dock for his yacht, enough space to host his family while keeping his business associates at arm's length. As always, Capone bought the property through a middleman. Direct payment would have attracted the IRS, and even in 1928, Capone knew the tax collectors were more dangerous than rival gangsters. Miami Beach's reaction was immediate and hostile. The city had been struggling. A 1926 hurricane had devastated the local economy, killing hundreds and destroying property worth millions. Northern investors had pulled back. The real estate boom had gone bust. Miami Beach was desperate to rebuild its reputation as a clean, respectable resort destination for wealthy tourists. And then Al Capone, the greatest gang leader in history, according to the New Yorker, decided to make it his home. The Miami News launched a crusade to drive Capone out. Front-page editorials, investigative pieces, interviews with terrified residents who feared that Capone's presence would transform their paradise into another Chicago. Never mind that South Florida was already a hotbed of illegal gambling, prostitution, corruption, and rum-running, as one historian noted. Those vices were fine as long as they stayed quiet. But Capone? Capone was loud. Capone was famous. Capone was bad for business. The city sued him, calling his Palm Island estate a menace to the safety and well-being of residents. Think about that for a second. A house, just sitting there, declared a legal menace because of who owned it. The American Legion hatched a plan to impose martial law, which would have stripped Capone of his constitutional rights. The governor of Florida, terrified of further damage to Miami's reputation, ordered all sheriffs in the state to arrest Capone on sight. For what crime? Didn't matter. Just arrest him, harass him, make his life miserable until he left. Capone was arrested multiple times in Miami, questioned, detained, released when his lawyers showed up with habeas corpus writs. Once he spent a night in jail on vagrancy charges. Vagrancy, for a man who owned $1 million waterfront estate. The police followed him everywhere. Reporters camped outside his gates. Miami Beach made it clear, "You're not welcome here." But Capone didn't budge. He'd paid good money for that house, and he wasn't going anywhere. Instead, he tried to win hearts and minds. He hosted goodwill dinners, inviting local businessmen and politicians to elaborate parties where champagne flowed and the finest steaks were served. He donated to charities. He talked about opening legitimate businesses in Florida. He played the part of the misunderstood entrepreneur, the immigrant success story, the family man who just wanted a place in the sun. It didn't work. Miami Beach wanted him gone, and they'd make his life hell until he complied. Except Capone had bigger problems than angry Floridians. Because while he was fighting with Miami, orchestrating massacres in Chicago, and building his empire, the federal government was building a case. Not for murder, not for bootlegging, for something far more mundane and far more dangerous. Tax evasion. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Organized crime figures like Capone were careful about murder charges. Witnesses disappeared, evidence vanished, juries got intimidated. But taxes? Taxes left a paper trail. And Capone, for all his intelligence about running criminal operations, had been catastrophically stupid about his finances. He lived like a millionaire. Multiple homes, custom suits, armored cars, champagne parties. But he'd never filed a tax return. Not once. Never reported $1 of income to the IRS. The legal theory was relatively new. In 1927, the Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sullivan that illegally earned income was still taxable income. You couldn't claim exemption just because your money came from crimes. If you made it, you owed taxes on it. And if you didn't pay those taxes, the government could prosecute you for evasion. Mabel Walker Willebrandt, the Assistant Attorney General, pioneered this approach. Go after the flashy criminals for their lavish lifestyles. Prove they had income. Prove they didn't pay taxes on that income. Conviction, prison. Simple. Capone's brother Ralph was the test case. In 1930, Ralph was tried for tax evasion and convicted after a 2-week trial, sentenced to 18 months. The feds had proven the strategy worked. Now they were coming for Al. The IRS, Special Intelligence Unit, blessed by newly elected President Herbert Hoover, began gathering evidence: bank records, property deeds, witness testimony from outfit bookkeepers who'd been offered immunity in exchange for cooperation. And that Miami estate, irrefutable proof that Capone had substantial untaxed income. You don't buy a waterfront palace on a second-hand furniture dealer's salary. Meanwhile, Elliot Ness and his untouchables, a squad of prohibition agents who supposedly couldn't be bribed, were hitting Capone's breweries and distilleries, gathering evidence of 5,000 separate prohibition violations. The feds were attacking from 2 directions: tax evasion and bootlegging. Even if one case failed, the other might stick. In May 1929, Capone made a mistake that would give the government more ammunition. He was in Philadelphia for a meeting when police arrested him on a concealed weapons charge. Capone and his bodyguard were both carrying guns without permits. Simple possession, usually a slap on the wrist. But the judge, sensing an opportunity to do something about public enemy number 1, threw the book at him. 1 year in prison. Capone served his time at Eastern State Penitentiary, and it wasn't the hellhole you might expect. He had a comfortable cell, furniture from home, a radio. He could receive visitors. He essentially ran his criminal empire from behind bars, passing orders to Frank Nitti and other lieutenants. It was barely punishment at all. But it did give the IRS time to build their case while Capone was a sitting duck. Released in March 1930, 2 months early for good behavior, Capone returned to Miami and to Chicago to discover the federal net closing around him. The Chicago Crime Commission officially designated him Public Enemy Number 1. The IRS had subpoenaed his financial records. Ness's raids were costing the outfit millions. And the press, which had once been somewhat sympathetic to Capone's Robin Hood image, had turned hostile after the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Capone tried to negotiate. His lawyers approached federal prosecutors with a plea deal. Capone would plead guilty to tax evasion and prohibition charges in exchange for a sentence of 2.5 years. The prosecutors agreed. Capone, thinking he'd outsmarted the government again, bragged to reporters about his sweet deal. 2.5 years? He could do that standing on his head. He'd be out before his 35th birthday, still young enough to rebuild his empire. But Capone had made a critical error. He assumed the judge would honor the plea deal. Judge James H. Wilkerson had other ideas. When Capone appeared in court in June 1931 to formally plead guilty, Wilkerson announced that he, the judge, was not bound by any agreement between prosecutors and defense attorneys. He could impose whatever sentence he deemed appropriate. Would Capone like to reconsider his guilty plea? Capone's lawyers went into emergency session. They'd prepared for a simple plea hearing, not a trial. But changing the plea to not guilty meant facing a jury with only hours to prepare a defense. Still, it was better than letting Wilkerson sentence Capone to whatever he wanted. The plea changed to not guilty. Trial set for October. Those months between June and October must have been surreal for Capone. He knew the evidence against him was overwhelming. He knew the feds had flipped his bookkeeper, who could testify about the outfit's finances. He knew about the property records, the lifestyle evidence, the witnesses who'd swear Capone lived like a millionaire while claiming to have no income. The trial began October 6, 1931. The government's case was devastating. They proved Capone had purchased property worth hundreds of thousands. They showed his gambling losses. Capone's defense tried to argue that he'd lost all his income gambling, but the prosecution pointed out that gambling losses can only offset gambling winnings for tax purposes, and Capone had never reported any winnings. They paraded witnesses who'd seen Capone spending money like water: custom suits, jewelry, cars, homes. Capone's defense was pathetic. His lawyers tried to argue that Capone's income came from gambling and therefore couldn't be reliably calculated for tax purposes. They tried to claim Capone was just a frontman, that other people really owned his assets. They tried to paint him as a simple man who didn't understand tax law. None of it worked. The prosecution's star witness was Leslie Lou Shumway, a cashier at the Hawthorne Smoke Shop, one of Capone's gambling fronts. Shumway had kept detailed records of the outfit's finances. He testified that Capone's income for the years 1926 to 1929 exceeded $1 million, roughly $15 million today. And Capone had paid zero in taxes. On October 17, 1931, after 9 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 5 of 23 counts. The courtroom erupted. Capone's face went pale. His lawyers immediately began preparing appeals, but everyone knew it was over. Al Capone, who'd survived assassination attempts, gang wars, and countless murder investigations, had been brought down by accountants. Judge Wilkerson sentenced Capone on October 24th. 11 years in federal prison, $50,000 in fines, $7,692 in court costs, and $215,000 plus interest in back taxes. The contempt of court charge from earlier, 6 months to run concurrently. Capone was 32 years old. If he served the full sentence, he'd be 43 when released. His empire would crumble without him. His enemies would move in. His men would drift to other organizations, and syphilis, still untreated, would continue eating away at his brain. You're witnessing the beginning of the end for America's most notorious gangster. But the real horror story hasn't even started yet. If you're captivated by how power corrupts and destroys, smash that subscribe button. Hit the like if you want to see how prison transforms a king into a broken shell. And drop a comment. Do you think Capone deserved what came next? Because what happened to him in prison is worse than any death sentence. Let's continue. The Cook County Jail held Capone while his lawyers filed appeals. They argued technical errors in the trial. They claimed the evidence was obtained illegally. They insisted Capone's constitutional rights had been violated. Every appeal was denied. The conviction stood. And on May 4th, 1932, Al Capone entered the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, inmate number 40,886. Atlanta wasn't supposed to be cushy, but for a celebrity prisoner like Capone, it might as well have been a country club. He had access to newspapers, magazines, radio broadcasts. He could send and receive mail, though all correspondence was monitored. Visitors came regularly: May, his mother, his brothers, his lawyers. Capone essentially held court from his cell, maintaining connections to what remained of the outfit. And he still had money, lots of it. Hidden in accounts under false names, buried in properties owned by shell companies, distributed among trusted associates. The feds had seized some assets, but Capone had been smart enough to diversify. He could still afford the best lawyers, still send money to his family, still maintain the fiction that he'd be back on top once released. But the prison administration was getting pressure from Washington. Herbert Hoover had made Capone's prosecution a priority, and now Hoover wanted assurances that public enemy number one wasn't running his criminal empire from a cozy Atlanta cell. Reports began circulating that Capone had special privileges: better food, comfortable furniture, unrestricted access to other prisoners who could carry messages back to Chicago. The solution was Alcatraz. The federal prison on a rocky island in San Francisco Bay had opened in 1934 as a maximum security facility for the most dangerous and high-profile criminals. Escape-proof, isolated, brutal. The worst of the worst got sent to Alcatraz, and the Bureau of Prisons wanted to make an example of Capone. On August 19, 1934, he was transferred from Atlanta to The Rock, becoming one of Alcatraz's first inmates. Everything changed. Alcatraz didn't give a damn who you were on the outside. Gangster, banker, killer, made man, didn't matter. You were a number. You followed the rules. You did your time. And if you caused problems, you went to solitary, the hole, where men went crazy from isolation. Capone was inmate AZ-85. He worked in the laundry, shoulder to shoulder with common criminals. No special treatment, no privileges, no respect. The guards treated him like any other prisoner, maybe worse because of his notoriety. Other inmates tested him, looking to make a reputation by fighting the famous Al Capone. Some of these men were stone killers who didn't care about Capone's Chicago legend. In Alcatraz, yesterday's accomplishments meant nothing. And the syphilis was getting worse. Capone had been infected since his early 20s, probably around 1917 or 1918. That meant the bacteria had been eating away at his body for 15, 16 years. Untreated syphilis progresses in stages. Primary, the chancre, the initial sore. Secondary, rashes, flu-like symptoms. Latent, years where the disease seems to disappear, lurking dormant. Tertiary, the final stage where the bacteria attacks the nervous system, the brain, the heart. By 1938, Capone was showing clear signs of neurosyphilis, the tertiary stage where the disease destroys brain tissue. He became confused, disoriented. His hands shook. He'd forget where he was, who he was talking to. Guards reported finding him standing in his cell, staring at nothing, drool running down his chin. The most feared gangster in America was turning into a vacant-eyed mess who couldn't remember his own name. Prison doctors examined him and confirmed what everyone had suspected: paresis, a late-stage syphilis manifestation that causes progressive dementia, paralysis, and insanity. There was no cure. Penicillin wouldn't be widely available for several more years, and even if it had been, the damage to Capone's brain was irreversible. He was 40 years old and had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child, according to psychiatric evaluations. The Bureau of Prisons faced an uncomfortable question. What do you do with a prisoner who's too brain-damaged to understand he's being punished? Capone couldn't comprehend why he was in prison. He'd forget conversations minutes after having them. He became incontinent, soiling himself because he couldn't remember to use the bathroom. Other prisoners mocked him, this pathetic shell of a man who'd once terrified an entire city. On January 6, 1939, Capone's sentence was reduced for good behavior. Ironic, considering he barely understood where he was. His 11-year sentence became 6.5 years. He was released on November 16, 1939, his 48th birthday still months away. May was there to collect him. So was his brother Ralph. They took the broken man home to Baltimore, where doctors at Johns Hopkins Hospital evaluated him and prescribed treatments that would do absolutely nothing to reverse the damage. From Baltimore, May brought her husband to the Palm Island estate in Miami, the house that had caused so much controversy, that had helped convict him, that represented everything Capone had fought for. Now it became his prison, more isolating than Alcatraz had ever been. What remained of Al Capone's life was a grotesque tragedy. He spent his days wandering the estate in pajamas and a bathrobe. Sometimes he'd fish in the bay, though he'd forget what he was doing halfway through. He'd have conversations with people who weren't there, long-dead associates, killed enemies, his father who'd died 20 years earlier. The family went along with these delusions. What else could they do? Arguing with a dementia patient doesn't bring them back to reality. It just agitates them. May cared for him with the devotion of a saint. This was the man who'd infected her with syphilis, who'd cheated on her with countless prostitutes, who'd built an empire on blood and corruption. But she'd married him for better or worse, and this was definitely worse. She bathed him when he couldn't bathe himself. She fed him when he forgot to eat. She cleaned him when he soiled himself. She endured the whispers from neighbors, the stares from strangers who recognized her ruined husband. Capone's son, Sonny, partially deaf from the syphilis his father had given him before birth, visited regularly. So did Capone's mother, Teresina, now elderly and heartbroken to see her beloved son reduced to this. His brothers came. His associates from the old days stayed away. Nobody wanted to remember Al Capone like this. Sometimes Capone would have moments of lucidity. He'd recognize May, ask about Sonny, talk about the old days in Brooklyn. Then the fog would return, and he'd be gone again, lost in whatever fractured reality his diseased brain constructed. Did he remember the murders, the power, the fear he'd inspired? Probably not. The Capone who'd built an empire had died in Alcatraz. What remained was just meat and bone, waiting to stop. On January 21, 1947, Capone suffered a stroke. He was at the Palm Island estate, surrounded by family. The stroke left him partially paralyzed, unable to speak clearly. For 3 days he lingered. On January 24th, he seemed to improve slightly. May allowed herself to hope. Then, on January 25th, Capone developed bronchopneumonia, his lungs filling with fluid, his damaged brain unable to coordinate the simple act of breathing. At 7:25 p.m., Al Capone's heart stopped. Cardiac arrest, the death certificate said. But really, he'd been dead for years. The man who died on January 25, 1947, bore little resemblance to the gangster who'd ruled Chicago. That Capone had died in Alcatraz, his brain eaten by bacteria he'd contracted in a Brooklyn brothel 30 years earlier. May had his body transported back to Chicago for burial. The funeral was private, family only, no press, no spectacle, no crowds of mourners or curiosity seekers. Just a few dozen people saying goodbye to a man most of them remembered very differently than the drooling invalid he'd become. Originally, Capone was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, but in 1950, May had his remains moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, where he was reinterred alongside his father, Gabriele, and his brother, Frank, who'd been killed in a shootout with police in 1924. A simple stone marker, no elaborate monument, nothing to attract grave robbers or vandals or tourists looking for a piece of history. And that should have been the end of the story. Al Capone, born in poverty, rose to criminal greatness, destroyed by disease and hubris. A cautionary tale about the American dream's dark side. Except the story didn't end with Capone's death. The myth was just getting started. Books, movies, television shows. Capone became bigger in death than he'd been in life. Scarface, 1932, hit theaters while Capone was still in prison, loosely based on his rise to power. The Untouchables, 1959, turned Elliot Ness into a hero and Capone into the ultimate villain. Brian De Palma's 1987 film Scarface reimagined the story with a Cuban immigrant in Miami, but everyone knew the archetype came from Capone. And in 1987, De Palma also directed The Untouchables, with Robert De Niro playing Capone in an Oscar-nominated performance that cemented the gangster's image in popular culture. Fedora, cigar, baseball bat used to cave in a traitor's skull. The real Capone was simultaneously less and more than the myth. Less because Hollywood glamorized the violence, turning brutal murders into entertainment. More because the reality of a syphilitic brain deteriorating in prison is more horrifying than any movie death. Capone's family scattered after his death. May lived until 1986, spending 40 years as a widow, fiercely protective of her husband's memory. She gave few interviews. She destroyed documents. She tried to control the narrative, insisting that Al had been a good husband and father who'd been unfairly persecuted. Maybe she believed it. Maybe grief rewrites history. Sonny changed his last name, trying to escape his father's shadow. He died in 2004, never having known a day without the syphilis his father had given him. Capone's siblings changed their names too. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up with stories about Uncle Al, some refusing to believe the worst, others ashamed of the family legacy. And what about the outfit? It survived without Capone, though never with the same prominence. Frank Nitti took over, running operations until he committed suicide in 1943 rather than face prison. Tony Accardo led for decades, dying of natural causes in 1992, having outlived all his enemies. The Chicago mob still exists, diminished but not destroyed, a shadow of what it was during Capone's reign. The myth persists because Capone represents something fundamental about America. The immigrant story, the self-made man, the entrepreneur who sees opportunity where others see obstacles. Except Capone's opportunity was prohibition, his product was illegal booze, and his business model required killing anyone who got in his way. Was he a mobster? Yes. Was he a monster? No, one distant relative told a biographer. That's probably true, Capone wasn't born evil. He wasn't a psychopath who enjoyed killing. He was a product of his environment. Poverty, limited opportunities, a culture that celebrated success regardless of how it was achieved. Given different circumstances, different choices, different luck, Alphonse Capone might have become a legitimate businessman. He certainly had the intelligence and ambition. But he didn't make different choices. He chose violence. He chose crime. And he paid for those choices with his freedom, his health, his dignity, and ultimately his life. The fact that disease destroyed him, rather than a rival's bullet, doesn't make it any less a consequence of his actions. If Capone hadn't been sleeping with prostitutes, he wouldn't have contracted syphilis. If he hadn't refused treatment to hide his infidelity, he might have been cured before the disease reached his brain. Every decision he made, every corner he cut, every person he hurt, it all led to that pathetic figure wandering a Miami estate in pajamas, talking to ghosts. There's a photograph of Capone from 1931, just after his conviction. He's wearing an expensive suit, fedora tilted at a rakish angle, cigar clenched between his teeth. His face shows the scars from that long-ago Brooklyn barroom brawl, but they've become part of his mystique. He looks confident, powerful, untouchable. Compare that to the last known photograph, taken sometime in the mid-1940s. Capone is bloated, eyes vacant, jaw slack. The man who'd commanded an army of gangsters can barely command his own facial muscles. His suit hangs wrong, his posture slumps. He looks exactly like what he is, a sick, broken old man waiting to die. That's the real story of Al Capone, not the glamorous gangster of Hollywood films, not the Robin Hood of Prohibition, not even the ruthless killer who orchestrated hundreds of murders. The real Capone is the man destroyed by his own choices, his own vices, his own refusal to accept that actions have consequences. The Roaring Twenties are long gone. Prohibition ended in 1933, making Capone's empire obsolete overnight. The speakeasies became regular bars. The bootleggers became beer distributors. The gangsters either went legitimate or went to prison. And Capone, who'd believed he was too smart to get caught, too powerful to fall, too connected to fail, ended his days as a cautionary tale. But the myth lives on, because we want to believe in the gangster with the heart of gold, the killer who takes care of his mother, the criminal who's just giving people what they want. We want to believe that Al Capone was somehow different, somehow justified, somehow more than just a thug who got lucky for a few years before the law caught up. He wasn't. Al Capone was a sixth-grade dropout who got his face slashed in a brothel, killed his way to the top of a criminal empire, infected his wife and son with a venereal disease, murdered hundreds of people, corrupted an entire city, and died alone with the mind of a child, unable to remember why he'd thrown his life away. That's not a hero's story. That's not even an anti-hero's story. It's just a tragedy, pure and simple. And if there's a lesson in Al Capone's life, it's this. You can't outrun your choices. You can't bribe your way out of consequences. And you can't kill the demons you create. Eventually, they come for you. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone's heart stopped beating. But his legend? That continues, distorted and romanticized. A myth that tells us more about America's fascination with violence than it does about the scared kid from Brooklyn who chose the wrong path and paid for it with everything he had. The American dream promises that anyone can make it in this country. Al Capone proved that's true. He made it to the very top. But the American dream doesn't promise you can stay there. And it definitely doesn't promise a happy ending. Capone's ending was neither happy nor dignified. It was pitiful, horrifying, and completely deserved. He built an empire on blood and left behind nothing but graves, grief, and a cautionary tale that nobody seems to learn from. The grave in Hillside, Illinois sits quiet now. Tourists occasionally visit, leaving pennies or whiskey bottles, little tributes to a man they know only through movies. The stone marker reads simply, Alphonse Capone, 1899 to 1947. My Jesus mercy. Mercy. That's rich, coming from a man who showed no mercy to his victims. But maybe that's fitting. Maybe Capone, in his final lucid moments, understood what he'd become and begged for the mercy he'd never given others. Maybe the disease that destroyed his mind was itself a kind of mercy, erasing the memories of all those murders, all those choices, all that wasted potential. Or maybe there was no mercy at all. Maybe Capone died exactly as he lived, violently, pointlessly, a victim of his own appetites and ambitions. The bacteria that killed him came from the same place as his scars, his inability to control himself, to think before acting, to consider consequences beyond the immediate moment. 3 razor cuts in a Brooklyn brothel. That's where it really ended, before it even began. The rest was just 28 years of a man trying to outrun a fate he'd carved into his own face. This is the true story of America's most notorious gangster. No Hollywood glamour, just raw truth. If this deep dive into Capone's rise and fall captivated you, subscribe to this channel for more untold stories from history's dark corners. Smash that like button if you appreciate honest storytelling that doesn't romanticize evil. And tell me in the comments, what forgotten crime figure should we expose next? Now you know the real Al Capone, not the myth, but the man. And the man was far more tragic than any movie could show.